Moments like this were long postponed, diluted, or quietly neutralized before they could harden into precedent. The reason is structural, not accidental. The American legal and political system matured alongside a culture that gradually confused wealth with competence and visibility with legitimacy. Over time, powerful individuals learned that time itself was their greatest ally. Delay a case long enough and public attention drifts. Complicated enough and accountability dissolves into procedure. This is why so many warning signs were minimized or misread, not because they were hidden, but because confronting them would have required institutions to challenge a mythology they themselves had helped sustain. The mythology that success places you beyond consequence. The mythology that disruption equals strength. How long can a system look directly at a problem and still claim it doesn't exist? What shifted here is not the legal framework, but the willingness to enforce it without exception. The mechanics are deliberately unglamorous, and that is precisely why they carry weight. Courts function on compliance, not performance. When deadlines are enforced instead of negotiated away, when bonds must be posted in real time, when asset valuations are tested against documented reality rather than personal assertion, power loses its protective fog. Financial disclosure laws were never designed to shame. They were designed to prevent distortion. Distorted numbers produce distorted decisions. Inflated assets unlock cheaper credit. Cheaper credit multiplies leverage. Leverage amplifies risk. This sequence has destabilized entire economies before. The court did not create a new doctrine. It simply reactivated safeguards that had grown dormant under political pressure and cultural fatigue. The immediate beneficiaries of this shift are not partisan rivals or ideological camps. They are institutions that rely on predictability to function, banks that must price risk honestly, investors who operate without privileged shortcuts, regulators who can point to enforcement and say, without hesitation, that the rules still apply. On the other side are those whose advantage depends on ambiguity, on stretching definitions until they snap back only after value has been extracted. Short-term corporatist interests flourish in gray zones. Long-term stability does not. That is the true conflict unfolding beneath the noise, not left against right, but extraction against sustainability. Ask yourself something simple. Who wins when rules become flexible only for the powerful? There is, however, a serious obstacle, and it is not written into law. It is psychological. A significant portion of the public has been conditioned to interpret accountability as persecution when it applies to familiar or admired figures. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Courts depend on public trust, yet public trust is increasingly shaped by narrative warfare rather than evidence. The risk is not an outright reversal of decisions, but a slow erosion of legitimacy, delay through outrage, exhaustion through spectacle. If the system bends under this pressure, it will not be because the law was weak, but because attention was fragmented. Can accountability survive when outrage itself has become a commodity? Remove the abstractions, and the impact becomes painfully concrete. Picture a household at the end of the month, recalculating expenses yet again. Rent has risen. Insurance premiums have crept upward without explanation. Credit card interest compounds faster than wages. These are not disconnected frustrations. They are downstream effects of financial systems trained to tolerate distortion at the top. When inflated valuations go unpunished, risk spreads invisibly through the economy. Ordinary people absorb that risk through higher costs and fewer options. Accountability at elite levels is not symbolic theater. It is economic gravity. Without it, the cost of living becomes a quiet penalty on honesty. Widen the lens, and the implications turn global. The credibility of American institutions underpins international finance. The dominance of the dollar rests not only on economic scale or military reach, but on legal reliability. Investors assume contracts will be enforced. Courts will function independently, and influence will not erase obligation. When that assumption weakens, capital does not flee dramatically. It recalibrates patiently. Other systems watch closely. Authoritarian governments study moments like this to determine whether rule of law is substantive or merely rhetorical. The answer reverberates far beyond one courtroom. This is where the moral question sharpens. Governance is not about humiliating individuals. It is about preserving trust across generations. A society that cannot impose limits on its most visible figures teaches its citizens a corrosive lesson. That rules are decorative, that integrity is naive, that survival requires bending before breaking. But when a court quietly refuses to bend, when it insists that consequences are real and immediate, it reminds us of something fundamental. Power is borrowed. Authority is conditional. Citizens are not asking for perfection. They are asking for a system that holds when tested by those who believe they are untouchable. Is that really an unreasonable demand? This collision did not emerge overnight. It was incubated in an environment where speed was rewarded and restraint was mocked. Politics gradually absorbed the habits of high-frequency trading. Say something explosive, watch the reaction spike, harvest attention, then pivot before the costs settle. This method thrives in systems where accountability lags behind influence. Trump did not invent this dynamic, but he weaponized it with rare discipline. Each controversy functioned like a volatility event, shock the system, overwhelm it, normalize the abnormal, then move forward as if nothing had happened. Institutions responded the only way they know how, slowly, methodically, often appearing weak in short term. That appearance became the narrative. But was it weakness or patience? To understand why this confrontation feels so decisive, you have to understand how institutions are designed to lose in the short run to win in the long run. Courts do not respond to volume. They respond to structure. They are constrained by statutes, procedures, evidentiary thresholds, and timelines that feel archaic in an age of instant reaction. This slowness created an illusion that rules were optional if you moved fast enough. But the law is not a trading floor. It does not mark assets to sentiment. It marks them to reality. When legal processes finally converge on behavior shaped by perpetual disruption, the impact is not dramatic. It is definitive. The technical mechanics of this case expose that contrast brutally. Financial representations are not opinions. They are inputs into regulated systems. When asset values are submitted to secure loans, to reduce insurance costs, or to influence tax treatment, they enter a legal framework designed to manage systemic risk. That framework assumes good faith, because it has to. Without that assumption, the entire credit system freezes. When good faith is abused repeatedly, the system responds not with emotion, but with recalibration. Oversight tightens. Penalties accelerate. Discretion evaporates. This is not vengeance. It is risk management. And risk management does not care who you are. Who benefits when volatility governs politics? Short-term actors do. Media ecosystems built on outrage cycles. Donors seeking leverage through chaos. Corporate interests that profit when regulation is distracted. Who loses? Anyone dependent on predictability. Small businesses planning investments. Workers negotiating wages. Families locking in fixed-rate loans. Stability is boring until it disappears. Then it becomes priceless. This is the hidden cost of political volatility masquerading as strength. It transfers uncertainty downward, always downward. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Who absorbs the risk when leaders treat institutions like obstacles instead of safeguards? There is a counterforce pushing back hard against this recalibration. It is the argument that enforcement itself is destabilizing, that applying rules to powerful figures will fracture trust rather than restore it. This argument is seductive because it frames accountability as a threat to unity. But unity built on exemption is not unity. It is quiet coercion. The real danger lies elsewhere. If institutions retreat again, if they signal that disruption still outpaces consequence, then volatility becomes policy. Markets understand what happens next. Risk premiums rise. Capital demands higher returns. Ordinary people pay the difference. Now bring this down to a single moment of ordinary life. A worker signs a lease renewal and notices the increase. It is not outrageous, just enough to tighten the budget. A bank explains that rates are higher because conditions are uncertain. A grocery bill creeps upward. None of these moments mention courts or politics, but they are connected. When trust erodes at the top, cost flows downward invisibly. Accountability is not an abstract moral stance. It is a price control mechanism on uncertainty. beyond national borders. This clash sends a signal. Global investors watch how the United States handles internal stress. Not speeches, not elections. Enforcement. The rule of law is America's most exported product. When it appears negotiable, alternatives become attractive. Other powers are eager to prove that efficiency without accountability is superior. But efficiency without trust decays quickly. This case becomes a reference point, not because of the individual involved, but because of the choice institutions make when tested by volatility. This brings us to the deeper question. What kind of society mistakes speed for strength? Institutions are not meant to thrill. They are meant to hold. When courts resist momentum, they are not out of touch. They are doing exactly what they were built to do. The real test is not whether disruption grabs attention. It always will. The test is whether a system can still say no when saying no is unpopular. That is the line being drawn here. And once drawn, it forces every citizen to ask a simple, unsettling question. Do we want a system that moves fast or one that lasts? This restraint feels shocking only because spectacle has trained the public to expect noise instead of resolve. In reality, restraint is the most disruptive force a court can deploy against someone accustomed to dominating attention. The historical context matters here. The modern legal environment has been shaped by years of performative confrontation, where high-profile cases became proxy battlegrounds for public opinion. Judges learned to anticipate pressure campaigns, media storms, and political retaliation. Many adapted by slowing down even further, stretching timelines to avoid becoming the story themselves. That instinct, while understandable, created a vacuum where delay became strategy. The system did not break. It bent, and in that bending, a belief took root that consequences were negotiable if you had enough reach. What changed in this moment was a recalibration of that instinct. The court stopped treating delay as neutral and began treating it as distortion. Technically, this shift rests on a simple but powerful distinction. Appeals are a right, but they are not a pause button on reality. Posting bonds is not punishment. It is insurance against flight from obligation. Financial penalties are not symbolic rebukes. They are instruments designed to neutralize unfair advantage gained through misrepresentation. When these mechanisms are activated together, they close the escape hatches that powerful defendants have relied on for years. No rhetoric, no improvisation, just procedure applied without hesitation. Why is that so unsettling? Because it exposes how much of power depends on expectation rather than law. The expectation that courts will hesitate. The expectation that enforcement will be softened to avoid controversy. The expectation that money can always buy time. Once those expectations collapse, influence recalculates instantly. The winners in this environment are not those seeking dominance, but those seeking durability. Institutions regain leverage. Regulators regain credibility. Competitors who played by the rules find the field leveling in ways they were told would never happen. The losers are predictable. Anyone whose advantage relied on stretching definitions, on treating compliance as optional until challenged, suddenly faces friction they cannot spin away. There is, however, a dangerous countercurrent. Restraint requires endurance. It demands that courts remain insulated from narrative backlash long enough for consequences to normalize. The obstacle is not a single ruling being overturned. It is the cumulative pressure to retreat quietly, to settle, to compromise enforcement in the name of calm. That is where many past efforts faltered. The tension here is real. Apply the law fully and risk being accused of destabilization. Ease off and confirm that volatility still wins. Which path preserves legitimacy? Which path corrodes it? Now bring this abstraction into a human frame. Imagine a self-employed worker trying to secure a loan. The bank explains that standards are tighter now. Documentation matters more. Valuations are scrutinized. This feels frustrating, even unfair. But why are those standards tightening? Because when high-profile actors exploit looseness at the top, the system compensates by squeezing everyone else. Risk does not disappear. It migrates. When courts enforce compliance where it was previously assumed flexible, that migration slows. Over time, borrowing becomes fairer. Not cheaper overnight, but more honest. Is honesty worth the discomfort? Extend the lens outward, and the geopolitical signal sharpens. Other nations study enforcement patterns as indicators of institutional health. Markets price credibility the same way they price debt. A country that enforces its rules evenly lowers its long-term risk premium. A country that hesitates invites speculation against its stability. This is not ideological. It is mechanical. Capital is impatient, but it is not foolish. When it senses that law still constrains power, it stays. When it senses that power bends law, it diversifies away. Quiet enforcement is louder globally than any speech. The philosophical core of this moment lies in an uncomfortable truth. Restraint is not weakness. It is discipline. Discipline is what separates authority from impulse. When courts act without theatrics, they deny demagogues their oxygen. They refuse to convert enforcement into performance. That refusal is deliberate. It signals that governance is not a stage. It is a system. A system only works if it applies pressure consistently, regardless of who resists it. So the real question emerges here, sharper than any headline. Can a society relearn patience in an age addicted to immediacy? Can citizens tolerate the discomfort of quiet consequences instead of dramatic vindication? This turning point is not about one individual facing limits. It is about whether institutions can still function as intended when tested by those who thrive on chaos. Power exercised correctly does not roar. It constrains. And once constraint returns, it forces everyone watching to reconsider what strength actually looks like. Many people sense that this moment is different, even if they struggle to articulate why. The difference is not rooted in severity, but in saturation. The system reached a point of precedent fatigue, a quiet exhaustion with repeating the same cycle and expecting a different outcome. Powerful figures learn to operate inside that cycle with precision. Stretch the timeline. Turn compliance into negotiation. Reframe scrutiny as persecution. Let public attention fragment, then walk away largely intact. This pattern became so familiar that it felt almost natural, as if accountability itself were an optional phase rather than a destination. That normalization is what finally collapsed here. What makes this moment unsettling is that the architecture refused to bend when bending was expected. The law did not respond emotionally. It did not escalate rhetorically. It simply stayed in place. Bonds were not theoretical threats, but immediate requirements. Asset valuations were not treated as personal narratives, but as measurable claims with downstream consequences. Statements that once lived safely in the realm of exaggeration were pulled into a legal frame where words carry weight because systems depend on them. Credit markets depend on them. Insurance models depend on them. Tax structures depend on them. Once those words enter formal filings, they stop being performance and start being inputs. That shift alone changes everything. This is where mastery of the system becomes visible. Financial and legal frameworks are designed around trust, because without trust they seize up. The assumption is not innocence, but consistency. When someone repeatedly exploits that assumption, the response is not moral outrage. It is recalibration. Oversight increases. Tolerance narrows. Enforcement accelerates. None of this requires new legislation or novel interpretations. It only requires the will to apply existing standards evenly. That evenness is what disrupts expectations, not because it is radical, but because it had become rare at the highest levels. Who does this unsettle the most? Not ordinary citizens. They live with rigid enforcement every day. Miss a payment, face a penalty. Miss a deadline, incur a fee. The discomfort surfaces among those accustomed to elasticity, among those who treated status as a buffer against friction. When that buffer thins, the entire hierarchy feels it. Corporate actors who assumed influence could manage outcomes, reassess risk. Political allies who depended on exception recalibrate distance. The system does not announce this shift. It reveals it gradually through compliance requirements that no longer soften under pressure. Ask yourself a blunt question. When was the last time rules surprised the powerful instead of the powerless? There is tension here, and it is structural. Enforcing standards consistently exposes how unevenly they were applied before. That exposure invites backlash. Claims of bias. claims of instability, claims that enforcement itself is the threat. This is the most fragile phase, not because the law is weak, but because legitimacy is tested when it finally becomes visible. The temptation to retreat is real, to compromise enforcement for calm, to trade clarity for quiet. That is how precedent fatigue usually resets. The question is whether it will this time. Bring this down to an everyday scale. A small business owner fills out loan documents, knowing every figure will be checked. There is no room for creative optimism. An employee files taxes, aware that discrepancies trigger automated scrutiny. For most people, this level of precision is not new. It is assumed. What changes when high-profile figures are held to the same standard is not punishment, but symmetry. Symmetry restores faith that effort and honesty are not structural disadvantages. That faith has economic value. It affects how people invest, save, and plan. Without it, cynicism becomes rational. The implications stretch far beyond domestic politics. Global markets watch how a country treats its elites under pressure, not speeches, not promises. Enforcement, the perception of equal application, reduces long-term risk. It signals that contracts matter more than connections. That signal stabilizes capital flows and reinforces institutional credibility. When that credibility weakens, alternatives emerge, slowly at first, then decisively. This is how influence erodes without a single dramatic event. The moral core of this moment is uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply embedded belief that some figures are simply too big, too loud, too disruptive to be constrained. The law's refusal to accommodate that belief is what feels jarring. It exposes a shield of status as thinner than advertised, not non-existent, but penetrable, and once penetrated, it cannot be fully restored. So the real question is not whether this individual faces consequences. It is whether the system remembers what it is for. Governance is not the art of managing personalities. It is the discipline of maintaining boundaries. When those boundaries hold, quietly and consistently, citizens are reminded of something essential. The rules were never meant to impress. They were meant to endure. And endurance, once demonstrated, changes behavior in ways no headline ever could. This is where the story stops being theoretical and starts touching daily life in ways that are impossible to ignore. The connection between a courtroom decision and a grocery receipt is not obvious, but it is real. When courts draw a firm line at the top, they do not just correct individual behavior. They recalibrate incentives across the entire economic chain. Trust is not an emotion in markets. It is a pricing mechanism. When trust erodes, uncertainty gets priced in. When trust is restored, even partially, that hidden surcharge begins to loosen. This is why accountability matters far beyond symbolism. Consider how asset inflation actually works in practice. Inflated valuations do not stay confined to balance sheets. They ripple outward. Banks lend more cheaply than they should. Insurers underprice risk. Competitors who play by the rules are forced to either accept thinner margins or mimic the distortion to survive. Eventually, the system compensates. Rates rise. Premiums climb. Standards tighten abruptly. And who feels that correction first? Not the architects of the distortion, but the people least able to absorb shocks. Does that sound familiar? When misrepresentation is punished at elite levels, something subtle but powerful happens. Risk models begin to align more closely with reality. Lenders become less defensive. Insurance spreads normalize. Mortgage assessments shift away from speculative optimism and back toward fundamentals. For a worker, this can mean the difference between qualifying for a loan or being priced out indefinitely. It can mean stability instead of volatility in monthly payments. These are not abstractions. They are quality of life variables shaped by whether the system rewards honesty or theatrics. Think about employment for a moment. Companies that thrive on distorted advantage often appear successful until they are not. They expand aggressively, cut corners, undercut competitors unfairly, then collapse under scrutiny or debt. Employees are left scrambling. Pensions suffer. Communities absorb the fallout. When accountability disciplines the top, it reduces the frequency of these boom and bust cycles. Jobs tied to sustainable competition last longer. Wages stabilize. Planning becomes possible. Is that not what most people actually want? There's also a psychological dimension that rarely gets acknowledged. When people believe the system is rigged upward, they disengage downward. Compliance becomes a burden instead of a shared norm. Why be precise if precision only penalizes you? Why play fair if fairness is selectively enforced? That erosion of civic trust has economic consequences. Productivity declines. Innovation slows. Risk-taking becomes either reckless or non-existent. Accountability at the top reverses that spiral by signaling that effort and integrity are not structural disadvantages. Of course, there's resistance to this shift. Some argue that strict enforcement creates uncertainty, that markets fear intervention. But markets fear arbitrariness more than rules. They fear not knowing who is exempt and who is not. Clear boundaries reduce that fear. Predictable enforcement lowers long-term volatility, even if it creates short-term discomfort. The alternative is a system where everyone pays a premium to compensate for unseen distortions. Who really benefits from that arrangement? Now, picture a simple scene. A family sits at a kitchen table reviewing expenses. Rent, utilities, food, transportation. Every line item feels heavier than it did a few years ago. No one mentions courts or asset valuations, yet the burden is connected. When financial systems tolerate distortion at the top, costs are redistributed quietly. Accountability acts like gravity, pulling inflated expectations back toward reality. It does not make life cheap. It makes it fairer. There is a difference. Zoom out one more level, and the global implications sharpen again. International investors do not analyze sentiment. They analyze enforcement. When they see a system capable of constraining its most visible figures, they infer durability. That durability supports currency strength, lowers borrowing costs for governments, and stabilizes trade relationships. When enforcement falters, the opposite occurs. Confidence erodes gradually, then suddenly. The kitchen table feels that too, through inflation and instability imported from abroad. This is why abstract justice matters. Not because it satisfies a moral instinct, but because it shapes material outcomes. A society that enforces accountability upward protects itself downward. A society that treats rules as optional for the powerful externalizes risk onto everyone else. The choice is not between compassion and discipline. It is between fairness and fragility. So the question that lingers is simple and uncomfortable. Do we want an economy where honesty competes at a disadvantage, or one where deception carries a cost? Courts drawing clear lines answer that question quietly, without slogans or speeches. And when they do, the effect does not stay in marble halls. It shows up where it always does. At the kitchen table, in the margins of ordinary lives, where trust is not debated, only lived. This employment dimension is uncomfortable precisely because it exposes a truth many institutions prefer not to articulate. Cultures are shaped from the top down, not by slogans on office walls, but by observed behavior. When leaders evade consequences, they teach an implicit lesson that rules are flexible if your position is high enough. That lesson does not remain abstract. It travels. Middle management absorbs it first. Targets become suggestions. Compliance becomes a box to check rather than a standard to meet. Shortcuts become efficiency. And slowly, responsibility is decoupled from decision-making. Who pays when that happens? Employees do, almost always. They pay through layoffs when risk finally materializes. They pay through frozen wages justified by market conditions created upstream. They pay when pension funds are exposed to over-leveraged strategies sold as innovation. This is not theoretical. Corporate history is littered with collapses that followed the same script. Aggressive expansion, inflated projections, ignored warnings. Then a sudden correction that arrives not as a headline about executives, but as a termination email for workers who had no role in the decisions that doomed them. Enforcing accountability at the top interrupts that chain early. It does something speeches and internal memos cannot. It changes incentives. When executives know that misrepresentation carries personal consequence, risk calculus shifts. Aggressive strategies face scrutiny sooner. Internal controls regain relevance. Compliance officers are heard instead of sidelined. That shift may slow growth on paper, but it stabilizes employment in reality. Stability does not trend on social media, but it compounds over time in paychecks and retirement accounts. There is also a subtler effect that deserves attention. Workers are not blind. They observe how leaders behave under pressure. When they see rules enforced selectively, cynicism becomes rational. Engagement drops. Loyalty erodes. Why invest emotionally in an organization that treats integrity as optional at the top? That disengagement has economic cost. Productivity declines. Turnover increases. Training budgets balloon. None of this shows up immediately on earnings calls, but it drains value steadily. Accountability reverses that dynamic by restoring coherence between stated values and actual consequences. Of course, critics argue that strict enforcement scares leadership talent away, that high performers require freedom to operate. But freedom without responsibility is not leadership. It is gambling with other people's livelihoods. Real talent adapts to constraint. It plans. It builds resilience instead of betting on exception. The idea that accountability drives competence away reveals more about the system's tolerance for recklessness than about the nature of talent itself. Ask yourself this. Would you trust your future to someone who only succeeds when rules bend? Now, consider a concrete moment. A worker nearing retirement checks their pension statement. The numbers are smaller than expected. Not catastrophic, just disappointing. The explanation cites market volatility, unforeseen corrections, external shocks. Rarely does it mention the root cause. That volatility was amplified by unchecked risk-taking earlier in the chain. Risk taken by people insulated from consequence. Accountability does not eliminate market cycles, but it dampens the extremes. It reduces the likelihood that retirement security becomes collateral damage for someone else's ambition. Expand the lens again, and the geopolitical dimension reappears. Global labor markets are interconnected. When large economies tolerate executive impunity, multinational corporations replicate those norms abroad. Standards erode across borders. Workers compete not on skill, but on how much instability they can endure. When accountability is enforced in influential systems, it sets a reference point. It raises expectations. It signals that long-term value matters more than quarterly spectacle. That signal shapes global employment practices more effectively than any treaty. The obstacle remains cultural resistance. Stability lacks drama. It does not reward outrage. It does not produce heroes or villains quickly enough. Yet stability is what allows families to plan beyond the next paycheck. To say without fear that a sudden collapse will wipe out years of discipline. To believe that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to be manageable. That belief is not naive. It is a foundation of social cohesion. This brings us back to governance, not as an abstract ideal, but as lived reality. A system that enforces accountability upward protects dignity downward. It tells workers that their effort is not merely fuel for someone else's unchecked risk. It tells managers that leadership includes restraint. It tells citizens that rules are not decorative artifacts reserved for powerless. So the question is not whether accountability is harsh. The question is who bears the cost when it is absent. History answers that clearly. It is not the architects of risk. It is the people whose lives are structured around stability they did not control, but depended upon. Enforcing accountability at the top is not punitive. It is protective. And in an economy where most people simply want a fair chance to build a future without sudden collapse, that protection is not a luxury. It is the minimum a functioning system owes its citizens. This moment cuts directly into a cultural belief that has been cultivated for years. The belief that strength is measured by how untouchable someone appears. Immunity became a proxy for power. If consequences never land, then the logic goes, authority must be absolute. But institutions were never designed to reward invulnerability. They were designed to withstand pressure by distributing it evenly. True strength in governance is not the ability to dominate outcomes, but the discipline to apply rules consistently when doing so carries a political or social cost. That discipline is rare, and that is why it feels disruptive now. Markets grasp this instinctively, even when public discourse does not. Volatility attracts attention. It creates winners quickly. It also erodes value quietly. Every spike in uncertainty demands a premium. Every exception priced into the system raises the cost of capital for everyone else. Stability, by contrast, does not announce itself. It compounds. It rewards patience, predictability, and trust. When a court enforces boundaries without theatrics, markets read that as a signal of durability, not excitement, durability. And durability is what attracts long-term investment rather than speculative churn. The cultural tension emerges because stability does not satisfy emotional appetites. It does not deliver instant vindication or dramatic collapse. It frustrates those who thrive on chaos by denying them narrative dominance. That denial is strategic, not accidental. By choosing long-term credibility over short-term noise, the court refused to convert enforcement into spectacle. It understood something fundamental. Institutions lose authority when they perform. They gain it when they persist. There is resistance to this idea because it forces a reckoning. If strength is not immunity, then vulnerability to rules becomes a measure of legitimacy rather than weakness. That reframing unsettles those who equated exception with success. It also challenges citizens to reconsider what they demand from leaders. Do we want figures who generate excitement through disruption, or systems that protect us from the fallout of that disruption? The answer is rarely shouted, but it is lived every day in economic choices and personal planning. Bring this back to material reality. Long-term credibility lowers borrowing costs. It stabilizes currencies. It encourages businesses to invest in productivity instead of defensive hedging. When institutions demonstrate that no one is above constraint, they reduce the hidden tax of uncertainty that weighs on wages, prices, and savings. This is not ideological. It is arithmetic. Markets punish systems that confuse strength with immunity because immunity undermines predictability. Predictability is the foundation of value creation. The geopolitical implications are equally stark. Other powers watch how democracies handle internal stress. They look for signs of decay or resilience. When accountability is applied evenly, it contradicts a narrative that pluralistic systems are inherently weak. It demonstrates that constraint can coexist with authority. That message matters in a world where alternative models promise efficiency by eliminating friction. Efficiency without accountability appears attractive until the costs surface. Then it becomes brittle. There's an obstacle here that cannot be ignored. Even-handed enforcement angers people who benefited from unevenness. That anger is loud, organized, and emotionally charged. It frames stability as oppression and discipline as hostility. This pressure tests institutions more than any legal challenge. The temptation to retreat is constant, to soften application, to seek compromise for peace. Yet peace built on exception is temporary. It postpones conflict rather than resolving it. The deeper moral question surfaces here. What do citizens actually want from governance? Protection from instability or permission to idolize it? Institutions exist not to validate personal loyalties, but to safeguard collective futures. When they choose credibility over applause, they fulfill that mandate, even if it feels thankless in the moment. This choice matters far beyond one individual because it redefines a social contract. It reminds everyone watching that power does not grant exemption. It invites scrutiny. That scrutiny is not an attack. It is a safeguard. It ensures that ambition does not outrun responsibility. That disruption does not eclipse duty. So the question lingers, quietly but insistently. In a world addicted to spectacle, can societies relearn the value of endurance? Can we accept that the strongest systems are not the loudest, but the ones that hold under strain? The court's decision does not answer that question conclusively, but it draws a line that forces it into the open. And once that line exists, it cannot be unseen. And this is the point where the abstraction of law intersects with the lived reality of society. Governance is not a theater, and dignity is not performative. Citizens do not require flawless leaders, but they do require systems that function as promised. When honesty and accountability are suspended for convenience, the social contract frays quietly, often without immediate alarm, until the consequences manifest in households and workplaces. A family budging for groceries, a small business negotiating loans, a worker planning retirement. All feel the ripple effects of a system that tolerates selective immunity. That is the invisible tax of exception, the price of treating the powerful differently from everyone else. When courts insist that consequences are real, they are not merely adjudicating disputes. They are communicating a principle. Authority is conditional, not absolute. This principle resonates far beyond the individual case, shaping expectations across industries, communities, and even global markets. Investors interpret as reliability, banks as enforceable agreements, and citizens as fairness. And fairness is more than moral. It is functional. It allows societies to operate without fear that the rules are merely suggestions for those who can command attention or capital. Stability, in this sense, becomes a quiet scaffolding that supports every economic, social, and civic interaction. Consider for a moment the alternative. If power is left unchecked, the system adapts around exception rather than integrity. Norms bend, incentives warp, risk migrates downward to those least able to absorb it. Middle managers cut corners because they emulate what they see rewarded above them. Employees bear the fallout. Pensions wobble. Jobs vanish. Public trust erodes. And yet, in these scenarios, the rhetoric of strength persists. It is easy to cheer spectacle, hard to respect restraint. That is the paradox. Real authority is measured not by who shouts the loudest, but by who can enforce rules evenly, even when it angers partisans, disorients allies, and frustrates admirers. The true test of democracy is revealed here, not in the applause of loyalists, not in the outrage of opponents, but in the consistent application of standards to those who wield influence. A society that allows fame or fortune to shield misconduct teaches a corrosive lesson to its citizens. Rules are optional, morality is negotiable, and endurance favors the loudest. Conversely, a society that dares to hold the powerful to the same measure it expects of ordinary people asserts a far stronger principle, that fairness and responsibility are non-negotiable. That assertion is not vengeance. It is the baseline for trust. It is the framework that allows markets, families, and communities to plan, to invest, to believe that effort is meaningful and consequences real. Global observers are attentive. 2. Authoritarian regimes watch for weakness. Investors monitor the consistency of enforcement. Systems that fail to apply consequences predictably lose credibility, both domestically and abroad. Conversely, when a court exercises restraint and rigor simultaneously, it signals that rules endure despite noise, influence, or spectacle. That endurance reassures, stabilizes, and maintains the invisible architecture upon which everything else relies. In this sense, accountability is not just a local victory. It is an international statement about institutional integrity. Ultimately, the lesson is simple but profound. Citizens do not owe leaders hero worship. They owe leaders vigilance, and leaders owe citizens fidelity to principles. When enforcement is applied evenly, when transparency is maintained, when consequences are inescapable, society gains something far more valuable than headlines: predictability, fairness, and trust. That is the scaffolding on which all other liberties rest. It is not glamorous, and it is not instantaneous, but it is enduring. So the closing reflection is clear. The power to act is always tempered by the obligation to act justly. The might of position is always accountable to the law of consequence. Citizens are owed nothing less than this framework. That is the ultimate measure of governance and dignity. Not who escapes scrutiny, but whether anyone can. Not who is loudest, but whether anyone is beyond reach. That is not ambition, not spectacle, not vengeance. It is the minimum standard of society that hopes to endure.